For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chief poobah of this place, executive director, hey you, I answer to many things. I'm delighted today to welcome on behalf of the Annenberg Center for Communication, on behalf of the Network Publics Group, Howard Rheingold. Howard has been an important thinker in the area of the new digital, IT communications conglomeration, what it's happening, what it means. And we are trying to see if we can't get him to play with us some more. So he's agreed to talk to us today about one of his newer projects, I think, on cooperation. To go along with it, I'm sure after questions he'll also take whatever questions you might have on smart mobs, their trajectory, and what seems to be happening. I don't believe in long introductions, particularly when none is needed. Howard, it was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. I see this is scheduled for 2 hours, and I want to assure you that I'm not going to stand up here and talk for 2 hours. But I'll be happy when I'm done talking at you to spend as much time as you'd like talking about lots of different issues. It doesn't have to be really confined to what I'm going to talk about here, which is you will see a very broad, very quick overview of what I think is an interesting emerging landscape. So I'm sure that there are people here who have the depth of understanding of each of the specialties that I'm going to talk about, who actually know something about it. I'm really talking about the emerging pattern, which may be visible if we connect the dots. And certainly there's a lot of room to dive deep about this stuff. So having said that, I'm here to enlist you in helping think about and spread a new story about how humans and other critters get things done. You already know very well the old story. Biology is war, in which only the fiercest survive. Businesses and nations succeed primarily by destroying, defeating, or dominating their competition. Politics is about your side winning at all costs. But I've been looking around and seeing little bits of information that I think point to a new story. Now, competition still has a central role, but not omnipotent, and shrinks just a little bit in this worldview to allow competitive strategies and complex interdependencies to expand a bit and move from the periphery of thinking about practically every human endeavor and close to the center. There's actually a very strong coevolutionary relationship between competition and cooperation. It's simply that a lot of the things that I'm going to point out have become visible only more recently. Now, I really started thinking about this 20 years ago when I started talking about virtual communities. I found a graduate student in LA who had some understanding from the point of view of the social sciences about why people who don't know each other would want to share information with each other online. Mark Smith, who's a sociologist at UCLA at that point, he's at Microsoft Research now. And he came up with 3 reasons: social capital, knowledge capital, and communion. My more recent book, zoom forward to 2001, was Smart Mobs. This is actually a gathering in Madrid. You will remember probably the terrorist bombings that happened there. The government claimed that it was the Basque separatists who did it. And because this was only a few days before the election, the electoral laws there forbade public political gatherings. And what happened was citizens sent text messages around, SMS messages from phone to phone saying the government is lying to us. Show up in front of their party headquarters this evening. And I'm presuming that most of you have read the book since it was published in 2002. So I'm not really going to talk a great deal about that, except to frame it by saying that actions like this, the ones, very similar actions self-organized by SMS that helped bring down the Estrada regime in the Philippines, more recently the Korean elections that were tipped, the racist riots in Australia, the violence around the Mohammed cartoons, many, many more instances of spontaneous political activity, constructive, destructive within the electoral system, outside the electoral system, in China, many, many incidents in China of the order of capitalist in Mercedes runs down a poor person on their bicycle, someone has a phone and sends out a message, and there's a civil disturbance around that. I found that when I finished Smart Mob, I didn't stop noticing and collecting information about cooperation and collective actions. Smart Mobs really being a subset of how mobile and internet-connected technologies enable people to communicate with each other, coordinate with each other, and organize actions in ways that they weren't able to before. And it occurred to me time and again, as I saw things in the newspaper, saw things on the internet, that this is really one aspect of a larger phenomenon. And in fact, I think that you can make the case that the coevolution of humans, our society, the technologies we create, the communication media we build on those technologies has been going on for a very long time. In fact, the case has been made that cooperation and social action and collective action has a lot to do with how primates became Homo sapiens. If you think about it logically, our primate ancestors came down out of the trees, found themselves on the savannah, surrounded by predators. They were very small, 40 or 50 pounds, no claws, no wings, no fangs, couldn't run all that fast, couldn't see all that fast. They were able to make stone tools, and they were able to organize collective food gathering and collective defense. We don't have a lot of physical evidence of exactly how they changed their social behavior around what they discovered socially, but we do know that for probably 10 times longer than what we call civilization has existed, humans, exactly like us, dress them up like us, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, existed as hunter-gatherers in extended family groups, moving around, pretty much satisfying their need for protein with small game. So that's what a small band can bring down. Now, protein's very important because we don't store it. We need it fresh all the time. So they had to keep moving around. We do know that some change happened during this period. They began to band together to hunt larger game. These small extended family bands began coordinating with people who weren't blood relatives to do this. And although there's not any direct evidence of this, I think logically we can presume they must have solved some collective action problems. It is, on the face of it, difficult, if not fatal, to hunt mastodons while you're squabbling with the other people that you're hunting with. I believe, and again, we don't have direct evidence for this, but logic dictates that some kind of social change must have been forced by the sudden appearance of a new form of wealth. Because after all, that's a lot of protein. In fact, suddenly the tribe had available to it more protein than the hunter's family could eat before it rotted. So the question arises, did the people who didn't hunt but ate owe something to the hunters or to the hunter's family? We don't know what the social arrangements were. We can presume that some form of symbolic communication must have been involved. About 10,000 years ago, settlements in river valleys began to organize larger irrigation projects, settled agriculture, led to cities. We began to see the first kind of mega social form, the first empires emerged, built of mud on those fertile plains. And in fact, it was primarily the people who kept track of things for these empires who began writing on mud to transmit information. And the alphabet developed a couple of thousand years later. Very, very quickly, of course, became a powerful medium. If you want to think that writing on mud is the technology, the medium was the alphabet. The knowledge of the alphabet enabled the transmission of cultural knowledge across time and space. One person could learn something that was very, very valuable and could spread that knowledge to others who weren't in the immediate vicinity or even in future generations. And of course, that power for thousands of years thereafter was reserved for an elite who were, for the most part, handpicked by the emperor, by the pope, whoever was in charge, whoever held power, controlled who had access to reading and writing. And we know, of course, that that was cracked open by the technology of movable type only about 500 years ago. Within a few decades, the population in Europe of literates grew from a few thousand hand-picked elite to millions of people. Somewhere close to 50% of at least the urban population of Europe within a few decades became literate. And it's really the literacy that emerged from a population using the medium, built on the technology, that enable new forms of collective action. And I think a strong case can be made that the fundamental cultural institutions of the modern world were enabled by a literate population. Now, if you want to talk about science, about understanding the physical world in a way that would yield practical benefits, that depended on genius for a long time. You needed an Aristotle to come along and order things. The real genius of the institution of science, only possible with a literate population, is that you can teach people to read and write. If they can learn the rules, they can perform experiments, they can perform observations, they can report what they find, they can publish that, and in the aggregate, that knowledge adds up to a lot more quickly than waiting for a genius to come along. Of course, Luther's virtual community was really spread because he nailed those 95 theses up on the cathedral door at about the same time that printed broadsheets became available. And I would argue that this was, in a real way, the first virtual community, in the sense that people who didn't speak the same language, didn't live in the same village, were willing to go to war together over an idea that they shared. And that idea was transmitted through literate populations by print. And of course, the public sphere that led to the overthrow of the monarchies in the continental United States and in France in 1776 and 1789 were very much print-based, literacy-based revolutions. The committees of correspondence were the conspirators who organized resistance in this country, and they were then the people who talked about how a people could govern themselves without a monarch. Again, I'm not saying that the printing press, that the technology created science or the Protestant Revolution or constitutional democracies. What I am saying is that literate populations are capable of organizing collective action that illiterate populations are not capable of organizing. And the media serve two roles. One is that they serve a role of communicating and coordinating, and the other role is creating a community. Literacy, in the sense that I use it, I adopt Postman's definition that illiteracy is the set of skills that you need to read and write, and those skills are the entry into a community, and that community can do things together that they weren't able to do before. And new forms of economic production became possible with literate populations. Now, certainly commerce is ancient, and markets must be as old as at least the crossroads where you could go with your extra tomatoes and trade them for somebody's sheep when they come down the road. But capitalism as we know it, it's really only about 500 years old, grew out of the conversations that happened in coffee houses, Lloyd's of London, the Royal Exchange coffee house broke off and became the London Stock Exchange. In Amsterdam, the investors in the Dutch East India Company, they met in coffee houses as well. And what they talked about was circulated in writing. The knowledge of how to do double-entry bookkeeping. All of these inventions, double-entry bookkeeping, limited liability corporations, insurance, those all added up together to create a means by which people could trust one another enough to do a transaction, even though they didn't know each other face to face, and even though they weren't exchanging actual physical gold anymore. Now, if you want to talk about the platform for the forms of media and collective action that we're seeing emerge now and will be seeing emerge in the future, you have to think about a technology that is considerably more powerful than the printing press. There are over 2 billion mobile phones in the world today. There's another 600 million projected to be distributed this year. As we know, these things get more and more powerful and cheaper every year. This thing is probably 1,000 times more powerful than the PC that I had to get my first bank loan for in the 1980s. And now we're talking about a significant portion, if not a majority of the population, walking around with supercomputers that are linked at speeds eventually much greater than what we consider to be broadband today. So if that's the technology platform, what are the media, and what are the social aspects of the forms of collective action that might become possible around this? Well, I think just in very general terms, the technologies are enabling several new operating principles in groups of people. One of them is networks. Manuel Castells has written very well about the fact that network society is a much better description of the kind of world we're living in than information society. Humans are, by our nature, in fact, maybe what made us human in the first place, social creatures. We naturally build social networks. And in a face-to-face oral tradition, or even the literate tradition of print, there are natural limitations with the number of people any one of us can organize any kind of social activity. The scope of those, do we know those people, or are they people we don't know but have something in common with? And the speed with which we can organize that. What the technological infrastructure of the technical networks have done is remove those constraints. And we're talking about networks both in sense of social structures and in the sense of the technological infrastructure that amplifies our capabilities to use that. Emergent self-organization. A lot of what we saw with smart mobs was emergent self-organization, and that's something that I'm not going to get into any depth about here, but I think it's important to talk about bottom-up, lateral, peer-to-peer organization now being possible in ways that only top-down, hierarchical institutional organization was possible before. And cooperative strategies. And that's what I've been looking into and what I want to talk about here, because I think probably most of you already know a great deal about networks, and you already know a great deal about emergent self-organization. When I started asking questions about what are the social sides of the kind of group behavior that technologies make possible, that led me to a literature I wasn't aware of before around social dilemmas. A social dilemma is any situation in which individual rationality adds up to collective irrationality. That's really at the heart of all of the one and many individual and group dilemmas that every person has, every institution has. I have my self-interest. I come from a long line of people who are good enough at protecting their self-interest to survive, at least long enough to reproduce, yet I participate in a society or in any number of groups in which we trade in a little bit of our self-interest for something that adds up to more for all of us. There are a lot of ways in which social dilemmas play out, and they've grown up three mythic narratives. I borrow this from Peter Kolek. If you're really interested in getting into depth about social dilemmas, he's done the best survey piece of that. He's at UCLA, sociologist. So the prisoner's dilemma, probably most of you know about. I'm going to move through it very quickly, but I'm going to talk about it simply because those of you who are not familiar with it ought to understand it, because I think it's a building block. It's a building block in terms of an obstacle which is overcome by various strategies. This comes from game theory that was invented out in Santa Monica at the Rand Corporation around trying to come up with thermonuclear war strategy. Now this is a pretty abstract thing because a thermonuclear war was something that nobody ever wanted to actually learn from in practice. So they tried to abstract how two players who don't communicate and who can't trust each other have to think about strategy. So this is really comes from a mathematical matrix, but a story was overlaid on it that makes sense of the mathematical matrix. And the mathematical matrix is what is inherent in any kind of unsecured transaction or game between two parties who can't directly communicate, make an immediate contract. You and your buddy are arrested, you're put in separate rooms, and you're interrogated by the police. And you're given the opportunity to rat out your buddy. That's called defect in the game theory language, or to remain silent. And that's to cooperate in the game theory language. And if you see the matrix, if you both remain silent, then you both do a short term. If you both rat each other out, you're going to go to jail for 4 times as long. But if you rat out your partner and your partner cooperates, remains silent, does not rat you out, then you go free and your partner gets a 10-year jail term. So the temptation to rat out your partner is the temptation to defect, and your partner gets what's called the sucker's payoff. And so most people in a situation like this are going to take the move that will be the least destructive to them because they're afraid of the sucker's payoff. But that prevents both of you from getting to an optimum outcome. There's another economic game that's not as well known as a prisoner's dilemma game that also lends some interesting insight into the nature of cooperation. This has been done with thousands of students, primarily, in trials in the US and Europe and in Japan. The first player, the players are screened so that they've never heard of the game before. They don't know what the game is. And they are in separate rooms. They don't know who each other are. They don't communicate, and they will never know who each other are. The first player is offered something of value. For a student, let's say $100. It's pretty serious. The second player is told, and then is asked to name a split. And the first player can say, we'll split it 50-50, or I'll get 90, and the other player gets 10, whatever they want to name. The second player is told what the split is, and they have the choice to accept the offer, in which case both players are paid, and they go home and the game's over. Or to reject the offer, in which case neither player is paid, the game is over and they go home. Well, modern economic theory is based on the assumption of the rational, self-interested actor. And it turns out, interestingly, that a fairly large percentage, of around 30 or 40% of the people will reject offers that they don't feel are fair. And even though they weren't knowledgeable about the game or told about it, intuitively the first players seem to know this because a pretty large percentage of them make offers, even though they don't have to, that are pretty close to fair. Well, it's not rational to reject $10 because someone you don't know in another room is going to get 90, yet people do that. One implication of this might be that there is some innate sense of fairness that people carry within us. Things got interesting just a few years ago when some anthropologists began taking this game to very different cultures, playing in whatever the currency of that culture was, and discovered that if you play the ultimatum game with nomadic pastoralists in Central Asia, or with slash and burn agriculturalists in Central America, or with people who grow yams in the New Guinea highlands, that they will have radically different responses. That there are some societies in which no offer is rejected, and societies in which no offer is accepted, and some in which the average offer is generous, and some in which it is not generous. And furthermore, they've presented evidence that the way in which a social group, the members of a social group, are likely to play an ultimatum game is very closely connected to the circumstances of daily life in that society. Which to me has very much more interesting implication, which is that our sense of fairness can be changed by our institutions. It can evolve. Oops, where did it all go? You know, huh? The other mythic narrative that I'm sure you've all heard of is the tragedy of the commons. Garrett Hardin wrote his paper in the late 1960s trying to warn people about the dangers of human population growth, getting out of control. And he used as a metaphor what happened to the commons in Europe and America and much of the world. Wherever you had common grazing territory that wasn't owned by anyone and that everyone could graze on, almost invariably, people would add one more sheep, one more cow to their herd, and in the aggregate, not out of any kind of malicious behavior, but just out of simple self-interest, they will end up overgrazing and thus making the grazing land forever unproductive. This, of course, because it was tied to human population, became very controversial because he said the tragedy of the commons is inevitable unless we have some kind of Hobbesian central authority regulating our behavior. Well, what's interesting about that argument is that it took over 10 years for a political scientist by the name of Elinor Ostrom to ask the question that any scientist ought to ask, which is it really true that humans always despoil commons? And if it's not true, what's the difference with those groups? She looked at thousands and thousands of cases. Some of the evidence is in court records. Some of them are in cultural myths. She looked at rice farmers sharing water in Bali. She looked at villages in Japan that harvested trees from the same forest for generations. She looked at the process that led to the water districts in Southern California, coming up with political agreements around water sharing. And she said something interesting about the prisoner's dilemma. She said, people are prisoners of the prisoner's dilemma as long as they consider themselves to be so. They can create institutions for collective action that overcome that obstacle. And interestingly, from these thousands of cases, she found that there's a small number of design principles that tend to be present when groups succeed in creating an institution for collective action, and tend to be absent when they fail to do so. Now, this is not the end of the story. This is really the beginning of the story. I hasten to add that there are others who point out that she held some variables constant in order to do this. The nature of the resource, is it a stock or is it a flow, for example? And that there are more things to learn about this, but I think it's an important piece of evidence that there's a lot more to be known than we already do know about how to go about overcoming the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons and creating institutions for collective action. We're facing a lot of those questions today. The privatization of scientific knowledge, the internet, net neutrality is a commons problem. How do we regulate radio spectrum? So commons problems can be about grazing, they can be about how to use technological resources, and we've been making decisions about that politically on the basis of very little empirical knowledge. I'm doing a very, very fast, very high altitude overview here just to give you the idea that there are things surfacing in a lot of different places. Now, in biology, the Darwinian paradigm for a century was really dominated by the survival of the fittest, omnipotent role of competition. And certainly, competition remains central to the Darwinian evolution. But there were a minority of people, starting with Peter Kropotkin, who wrote about mutual aid, who pointed out that there are a lot of cooperative arrangements in the natural world that was sort of taboo. It was not really kosher to discuss this in biology until Lynn Margulis really nailed down the importance of symbiosis when she presented very strong evidence that the mitochondria, the little energy dynamos inside every living cell, were originally endosymbiotes. That two organisms got together sometime in the distant past and made evolution of organisms that produce their own energy possible. In fact, she has gone further than that to develop the theory of symbiogenesis, that from the very beginning, cooperative interdependencies were as important as competitive filtering in driving evolution. In order for DNA to replicate, those two different strands have to cooperate. I mean, I'm anthropomorphizing this a little bit, but there are arrangements that are very strongly interdependent. If you look at forests, trees do compete for sunlight. There's also another scarce resource that organisms compete for, nitrogen. And it's hard to get nitrogen out of the atmosphere and convert it into plant cells. However, trees that have plant roots which host fungi that create a hospital environment for nitrogen-fixing bacteria make trillions of bacteria and billions of fungi and millions of trees possible, where you might only have had a very small number of trees. So there's a competition on one level. The trees that grow fastest are going to outcompete the ones for sunlight that grow more slowly. But we have a system in which all of the different competing organisms cooperate to multiply a scarce resource rather than to compete for it. symbiogenesis, evolutionary psychology, and other theories about cooperative relationships in biology remain controversial about their mechanisms, but there's very little controversy about the fact that cooperation has moved from the periphery to the center of biological theory. Hello, this keeps happening. The idea that, that people will always only act in their self-interest has also been attacked by studies on altruistic punishment. Turns out that people will pay their own value in order to punish cheaters. I think this is internally something that we all understand. What's that feeling that you get when someone cuts you off on the freeway? Or why is it so irritating when someone cuts into line? So actually some of these cooperation games, prisoner's dilemma games, have been done with repeated trials with brain imaging going on at the same time. And it turns out that the areas of the brain that are very active when people are feeling rewarded light up when they're punishing cheaters in these games. You can punish a cheater by spending some of your winnings to take away some of their winnings, which led one of the scientists, and this is pretty new stuff here, to hypothesize that altruistic punishment may be the glue that holds societies together. Well, I think we saw that in the past, literacy enabled the emergence of capitalism. We've seen the fall of communism and the assumption that economic evolution has stopped. But I think we have a lot of evidence, and those of you here who heard Dr. Benkler when he was here know what I'm talking about, that new forms of economic production are emerging. Business Week, famous left-wing publication, began to talk about this not too long ago. I think you see the cover of the new Newsweek is about putting the we in the web. There's something happening out there, and it's not just with individual hackers creating startups. Toyota is famous for treating its suppliers as a network rather than a market, and instead of playing them against each other, they spend their own money to increase cooperation among them. This paid off in 1997, a plant that creates a part that's essential to each one of the 30,000 cars that comes off the assembly line. Burned down one night. That was the Eisen fire, for those of you who are Googling this stuff. And Toyota got together this network of suppliers, not owned by Toyota, but mutually interdependent, and figured out what kinds of machines were in that factory, where you might find similar machines, where you might move them to, how you could connect them, how you could debug the assembly line and get that component turning out again within 3 days. They know something about cooperation that General Motors is desperately trying to learn. IBM, HP, and Sun have open sourced billions of dollars worth of their software. In their self-interest, they are recruiting a lot of volunteers to help improve something that's useful to everyone and that also, as a side effect, improves the value of their proprietary products. Eli Lilly, notoriously secretive and competitive big pharma industry, created Innocentive, a market for solutions. So if you are a chemist and you are having a hard time with a synthesis, you can put your problem up on Innocentive, and a solver somewhere can give you enough information to prove that they really know how to solve the problem. You make a deal with them, a contract, intellectual property contract is made, money does change hands. Within a couple of weeks of starting this experiment, a pharmaceutical chemist with a difficult synthesis found the answer because a petroleum chemist in Kazakhstan had been working on the same synthesis from a different direction. We know from Linux and Mozilla, that operating system and browser software that can challenge the dominance of Microsoft has been created without the incentives of the market as we know them, or the coordination hierarchy of a firm as we know it. Google's AdSense makes a little bit of money for tens if not hundreds of thousands of bloggers. Amazon has over 500,000 people who create little Amazon shops. Both Amazon and Google have opened their application programming interface, really some of the crown jewels to their money-making machinery, to enable a very large population to share in the wealth that they created, and of course, make them a lot wealthier in the process. An unsecured transaction is a prisoner's dilemma. You don't want to send that check because the sucker's payoff is going to be not getting the goods. And the person with the goods doesn't want to send the goods because they might not get the check. This is a market that should not exist. It does exist because of this simple and gameable but working reputation system that enables a prospective buyer to check out what previous buyers have to say about a particular seller. That gives them enough information to change a prisoner's dilemma game into a different matrix known as an assurance game. Prisoner's dilemma game is neither of us can trust each other, so I'm going to take the most protective move even though we both lose thereby. An assurance game is if you can assure me that you will cooperate, then I will too. So trust is certainly the lubricant of cooperation, collective action, and markets. And eBay has made a great deal of money for themselves and enabled people to make billions of dollars on their own through the transactions that the online marketplace enables. It's the reputation system and an online place that brings buyers and sellers together. It's a group forming network, as David Reed would call it. If you're interested in buying Meissen figurines, you can connect directly with people who are interested in selling Meissen figurines. It's really the combination of those two. Don't have to explain Wikipedia to anybody in this room, but who would have thought just a few years ago that a few hundred volunteers would be able to create a free encyclopedia with millions of articles in over 100 languages, and they aim to create a free encyclopedia for everybody on the planet in their own language. You can apply what Wikipedia and eBay and Innocentive have done to the nonprofit sector. So if you are an NGO and you're in a developing country and you have a problem that can be solved by design, then design students around the world will look at ThinkCycle and see if they can come up with a solution for that problem. One of the problems that was posed early in the life of ThinkCycle was hydration of cholera victims. People who have cholera need to have intravenous hydration. It's too expensive to distribute in large numbers to places where cholera breaks out, which are usually pretty poor areas. And B, you need to be able to teach illiterates how to use it because there aren't enough trained personnel. So the ThinkCycle people actually did come up with a cholera hydration unit at 1/10 of the prior cost of that illiterates could be taught to use. In fact, in time to use for any of the places that cholera might break out with the displaced refugees from the tsunami. SETI at home, people contribute their individual computing power while they're not using their computers to crunching numbers to see if we're getting signals from outer space. People who have contributed their cycles to that amass about 20 teraflops, 20 trillion operations per second of computing power. If you're interested in a more terrestrial and urgent problem, you can contribute your cycles to Folding at home, folding.stanford.edu. In order to understand the immune system, to try to find a cure for cancer, to make new medicines, you need to be able to understand how proteins fold in 3 space. And there's such a large possibility space there that even powerful computers would take hundreds of years to run through the possibilities. But folding at home has cut those hundreds of years down to months by enlisting thousands of people. So again, I return to what I think is the technological platform for future kinds of collectives. Billions of people carrying around supercomputers linked at broadband speeds. What kind of scientific research are we going to be able to do that wasn't even thinkable before, simply by enabling people to volunteer? And there may be economics around this as well. We're seeing also with mashups, with remixes, with viral do-it-yourself media from YouTube. Well, I guess Napster was like the ancient world, and YouTube is the present world. But we're really seeing culture created by populations, sharing it with populations, rather than it being broadcast. There's nothing new about this. I wrote about many-to-many in the virtual community, saying by illustration that every desktop is now potentially a printing press, broadcasting station, community, marketplace. Now it's every telephone in your pocket that is potentially a creator and distributor of culture. Obviously, I think that there's a connection between all of these things. We're talking about the social strategies for creating institutions for collective action and overcoming social dilemmas. Why all of these examples work now when such kinds of markets and institutions weren't available before is that we now have technologies that enable people to act in these ways. Again, technology didn't create it, but I think those of you who remember the beginning of the web really spread because of view source. You didn't know how to do very much HTML, but you could see how someone else did and copy and paste it. Justin Hall started updating his website in 1993, but you had to, if you wanted to update your website every day, you had to write the HTML, FTP it to a server, and change the permissions on that file. By simply making it a web form that would make it easy for you to update your website every day, we now have something like 30 million blogs, wikis as well. I won't go through all of these. This is, again, not the last word. I think that this is a foundation for the beginning of an interdisciplinary research program about why is it that these things work, and if we know that, could we design better and new technologies of cooperation? I simply want to point out this one down here because the word collective action sounds so much like collectivism that whenever I talk about this online, I get the inevitable, this is communism business. This is about people acting in their own self-interest in a way that adds up to more for others. It's emergent from the individual up to the aggregate population. It's not centrally planned, and it's not coerced. Because the internet has been treated as a commons, did not stop Jeff Bezos or Jerry Yang or any number of other billionaires from creating private property around it. Competition and cooperation, private property and common property can be shared. We simply need to know a little bit more about how that happens. Well, I think we are seeing more and more institutions taking advantages of these technologies to create platforms for participation. Omidyar Network, Pierre and Pam Omidyar, ended up with about $15 billion worth of stock from eBay, and they decided not to go the Rockefeller, Ford, Gates route and create a foundation, but to start with the principles that made eBay successful. Pierre Omidyar is quoted as saying, the most important thing about eBay is that 150 million people learn to trust each other enough to have transactions. So they're starting a network They've got an online network where there are donators and there are people who've got projects, and they hope to create a new kind of philanthropy. Jeff Skoll, the lesser-known founder of Omidyar, has started an online community to put philanthropists and nonprofits together. So I think we're seeing just the emergence of the first generation of institutions that take advantage of these technologies to create platforms that enable participation that creates a lot more wealth for everyone. Well, I'm zeroing in on the end here. When I started this, I thought that catalyzing an interdisciplinary study of cooperation would be easy, and it was then that I discovered that our institutions, this one is an exception, but most of our institutions, almost all of our institutions for creating knowledge have, by their nature, created perverse incentives for interdisciplinary work. By rewarding specialization, the more you know, the more budget you have, the more power you have, the more well-known you are, the more you have at risk to actually step out of that specialty and participate with others in some kind of unknown territory between the specialties. So I teamed up with the Institute for the Future, which is a nonprofit organization. It was started by some of the people at RAND and SRI who wanted to bring the war strategy kind of think tank to the public and private sector and out of the defense world. So in collaboration with them, I created a website, the Cooperation Commons, cooperationcommons.org, and we spent some time creating some summaries of the key documents. There's 70 of them, just so an economist can find out a little bit about what the biologists know, and the sociologists can find out a little bit about what the political scientists know. Each one of these documents we've created have the link or the bibliographic citation to the source document, but also it's got a one-sentence summary and a one-paragraph summary. And the idea is that eventually we will build an interface to this thing. Hello.
Disconnected?
Yeah, but isn't that interesting? It wasn't connected. Well, we'll wait for the spinning beach ball and I'll describe what's happening. The idea was to create some visual maps. There's not a map. There are any number of maps that you could make of this territory. And by moving your mouse over that map, you would be able to find a hot spot at which one of these documents existed, and the one-sentence summary would pop up. Or you could hold the mouse key down and the one-paragraph summary would pop up, or you could click through and get a Wikipedia-type page. We also have about a dozen videos from the course we taught on literacy of cooperation at Stanford. That was a little clip of Jimmy Wales talking about what glues Wikipedia together. At the end of his talk, I don't know whether he hasn't spoken here yet. Okay, I won't ruin his talk, but I think you'll see some connections between them there. But the idea here is that we would be able to have a map, many maps, that would give a visual representation of the territory that would connect to a growing knowledge base. That's the Cooperation Project, cooperationcommons.org, and that's about where I am with it now. So that's the end of me talking to you.